By the time Park Taywan saw the white envelope on the pillow, the closet behind it was already empty, and the only sound in the 40-room house was his own watch ticking against his sleeve. "Read only after I'm gone," my handwriting said, small and certain, and the black lion of the Parkong Group stood in the middle of that room, the way a man stands when he realizes the war he prepared for was never the war he was in. But before you hear how that envelope was read, you should hear how it was written. You should hear how the silence that built it lasted 6 months, and how one truth inside it cost him everything he thought he owned. I want to start where it ended, because that is where I finally understood myself. The law offices of Jung and Associates smelled like new carpet and cold coffee, and the rain outside the tinted windows stuttered in uneven little bursts, like something trying to find its rhythm and failing. I sat across the table from the man I had married in a black suit I'd bought that morning, still creased along the fold lines from the plastic wrapping, because I owned nothing in that house that felt like mine to wear out of it. The small gold teardrop at my throat was the only thing on my body that had been mine before him and would still be mine after. I remember the small details of that room with a clarity that almost embarrasses me now. The way you remember every texture of a moment you know, even as you're living it, you will replay for the rest of your life. The particular gray of the light through the tinted glass, the faint chemical smell of fresh carpet glue underneath the coffee, the weight of the pen the paralegal had set down beside the papers, a heavy, expensive thing, the kind of pen a man like Taywan would think nothing of leaving behind in a room he never intended to return to. My own hands, folded in my lap beneath the table where no one could see them, pressed so tightly together that the tips of my fingers had gone faintly white. I had rehearsed this moment more times than I wanted to admit to myself. In the shower, in the atelier, sanding a table leg that did not need any more sanding, lying awake on the narrow cot, listening to the house breathe its enormous, empty breaths around me. I had imagined myself breaking, imagined my voice cracking on the word divorce, imagined him reaching across the table at the last second the way men do in the films I used to watch with my mother, before everything, before soul, before any of this. None of that happened. The room was simply quiet and cold and very, very still, the way a room is still right before something in it changes permanently. He sat across from me with his lawyer beside him, and even now, even here at the end of us, he was unreadable. The black lion tattoo climbed the left side of his neck and disappeared beneath his collar, the way it always did, the way it had the very first time I saw it, and thought, foolishly, that a man who wore something so fierce that close to his throat must have a reason for hiding the rest of himself just as carefully. His lawyer slid the settlement papers across the table toward me, and I remember the particular sound they made against the lacquered wood, a soft hiss like a held breath finally released. "You're certain," the lawyer said, though he was looking at Taywan when he said it, not at me, as if my certainty were something that needed to be filtered through my husband before it could be believed. "I want nothing that belongs to him," I said. I felt Taiwan's eyes on me then, the first time he had looked directly at me in longer than I wanted to count, and I did not look away, because I had promised myself in the car on the way there that I would not be the one who looked away first, not this time, not after everything. I signed the papers once. My hand did not shake. I had expected it to shake, had braced for it in the elevator, had practiced holding a pen steady the night before like a woman rehearsing a smaller, safer kind of surgery. But when the moment came, the nib only scratched once against the paper, a small sound, final as a lock turning, and that was all. That was the whole sound of the end of my marriage, a scratch, and then nothing. I stood. I gathered my coat over my arm. And because 6 months of silence in that house had taught me that some things only cost you something if you let them, I looked at him one more time, at the man across the distance he had built brick by brick with his own 2 closed hands, and I said the truest thing I had left to give him. "Take care." I meant it. That was the part that hurt the most, if I am honest with you now, telling this the way I promised myself I would someday tell it plainly. I meant every syllable of those 2 small words, and meaning them while I turned my back and walked toward the elevator was the most expensive thing I have ever done in my life. The elevator doors closed on my reflection before they closed on the room, and in the polished steel I watched myself straighten the gold teardrop at my throat, watched myself breathe once, twice, the way you breathe after holding your breath underwater longer than you meant to. I did not look back through the closing gap. I did not need to. I already knew what his face would be doing, or rather, I knew what it would not be doing, because in 6 months of marriage I had learned that Park Taiwan's face did very little at all, and that this was, somehow, the loudest thing about him. 9 hours later, he would climb the marble stairs of a house with 40 rooms and find the master closet standing open. Hangers still swinging faintly on the rod, the way empty things move when something has just been taken out of them. And on the pillow of the bed we had shared, and not shared in equal aching measure, he would find a single white envelope with 3 words in my handwriting.
Read only after I'm gone.
His thumb would slide beneath the flap, and there, in that gutted room at 2 in the morning, is where I have to ask you to wait with me, because to understand what was written inside that envelope, you first have to understand how a woman ends up writing it at all. You have to go back 6 months, to a birthday with 2 empty places set at a table too long for 2 people to ever really share. To a candle that burned down slow and lonely until the wax finally pulled it under and drowned the flame in its own melting. I was 29 years old on that birthday, and I had been married to Park Taywan for just under a year, and I sat at the head of a table built to seat 20 and set 2 places anyway, out of habit, out of hope, out of the particular stubbornness that had once made me good at my work and was now, I think, the only thing keeping me upright in that house. I lit 1 candle. I did not light 2, because I had stopped believing, sometime in the previous month, that 2 candles were something I was allowed to want. I watched the wax climb down the sides of it in slow, translucent runnels, watched the flame gutter and struggle against its own gathering pool, and I did not move to save it. I let it drown. I think some part of me needed to watch something finish dying on its own schedule, instead of mine, just once, just to know what that looked like from the outside. He came home at 3 in the morning. I heard the door, the particular weight of his footsteps on the marble, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who owns every room he walks through and has never once had to hurry into any of them. I heard him pass the dining room. I heard him not slow down. That was the whole birthday. That was the whole marriage, distilled into a hallway and a set of footsteps that did not pause. The cage I lived inside of was not built all at once. I want you to understand that because I think it matters. I think it is the difference between a man who traps you on purpose and a man who traps you by accident, 1 small brick of silence at a time, until one day you look up and the walls are simply there and you cannot remember which brick was the first one. Mrs. Han, the Ajumma who ran that house with a quiet, absolute authority, poured my tea every morning at grey dawn before the sun had fully committed to rising, and she did it with a kindness that felt like the only warm thing in that entire cold marble kingdom. Down the long corridor, men in dark suits stood at posts I never saw them leave, and they looked past me the way you look past furniture, not out of cruelty, I understood eventually, but because looking at me directly would have meant acknowledging that I was a person and not a fixture, and acknowledging that was somehow against the house rules. I began falling asleep in my atelier, on a narrow cot I'd had brought in for the nights I worked late restoring some antique piece or another, and more, those nights stretched into every night until I woke one grey morning with a wood grain print pressed into my cheek from where I'd fallen asleep against an unfinished tabletop, my hand still curled loosely around the small gold teardrop at my throat, the one physical thing in that entire house that connected me to a version of my life that had once made sense. I did not cry that night, or many of the nights after it. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people expect tears from a story like mine, and what I actually felt was quieter and, in its own way, worse. I simply stopped expecting the door to open before I fell asleep. I stopped counting how many nights in a row it hadn't. Somewhere in that 6 months, I moved from hoping to a kind of low, permanent stillness, the stillness of a woman who has decided that hope is a luxury tax she can no longer afford to keep paying. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside a full house, and I don't think anyone can explain it to you properly until you've lived inside one. It is not the loneliness of an empty apartment, of silence you chose, of a life with no one else in it by circumstance. It is the loneliness of knowing there are 40 rooms around you, and staff moving quietly through half of them at any given hour, and guards posted at every exit, and a husband asleep 2 floors above you in a bed you no longer shared, and still, somehow, not one voice in that entire structure that would say your name simply because it wanted to. I used to lie on that narrow cot and listen to the pipes ticking as the heat cycled on and off, and I would think, this house has a pulse and I don't think I'm part of its circulation anymore. I had become something the house maintained rather than something the house held. My work became the only place I still recognized myself. There is an honesty in restoration that I have never found anywhere else. Not in conversation, not in this marriage, not even, if I am honest, in myself most days. Wood does not lie to you. A hairline crack tells you exactly how it happened if you know how to read it. Tells you about the humidity in the room it sat in for 80 years. About the hand that dropped it once and never told anyone. I spent hours some nights simply running my thumb along old grain, feeling for the places where the finish had worn thin, and there was a comfort in that attention that I could not find anywhere upstairs. I told myself I was restoring furniture. I understand now that I was also, very quietly, trying to restore myself, one small deliberate motion at a time, in a house that had stopped noticing whether I was whole or not. When I first arrived in his world, I did not understand yet what 40 rooms of marble and glass could do to a person who grew up in a 2-bedroom walk-up, learning to love the smell of linseed oil and old varnish from her grandmother's restoration shop. Mrs. Han taught me the rules the way you'd teach a child to survive a house full of sharp corners. Never speak first, never touch the lion tattoo, not even in passing, not even by accident. Never walk anywhere in that compound unguarded, not to the market, not to the doctor, not even to the small garden at the back where the koi moved beneath the water like slow, silent thoughts. The men who followed me on those errands never spoke a single word to me, not once, not in a year. One night I passed the half-open door of his private study and I saw something I was never meant to see. A man knelt on the cold marble floor and there was blood, small dark flecks of it, on the white silk cuff of Taywan's shirt, and the gold lighter I so often heard clicking in his pocket, clicked once, as he lit a cigarette he did not seem to actually want, and he did not offer the kneeling man a chair, did not offer him anything at all except the terrible patience of a man who has all the time in the world and intends to use every second of it. Then he saw me in the doorway. The temperature of the room changed. I don't know a better way to describe it. The men present, the guards along the wall, seemed to bow lower to me in that instant than they had in the hour before it, as if my presence had rearranged some silent hierarchy I didn't fully understand and never would. He walked me to the kitchen himself, his hand not quite touching the small of my back, close enough that I could feel the heat off his palm and not the weight of it. He said nothing the entire walk. He let me pass through the door ahead of him, and then he was gone again, back into whatever that room required of him, and I stood alone in the kitchen with my heart going too fast and no words for what I had just witnessed. Later that night, alone, unable to sleep, I found myself in his study. In the small window of time I knew the guards changed shifts, and I found a ledger left open on the desk, numbers I didn't understand, names of shell companies stacked in columns like a language I'd never been taught to read, and in the margin of one page, beneath a line I now understood to be some accounting of assets, there was a single word written in his own hand, beneath my name. Her. I could not tell, standing there in that lamplight with my pulse loud in my own ears, whether that word meant property or prayer. The ink had not even fully dried. I touched it with the pad of my finger, very lightly, the way I would touch a fresh coat of varnish to test whether it was ready to be handled, and it smudged, just slightly, under my touch. I have thought about that smudge more times than I can count in the months since. I still don't know what it meant. I don't know if he does either. By the 6th month, the erosion I'd been living inside of had become visible even to me, even in the mirror, which I had started avoiding in the particular way you avoid evidence you don't want to have to explain to yourself. I moved my life almost entirely into the atelier. Chisels, clamps, fine sable brushes, small glass jars of pigment I mixed by hand from raw powder the way my grandmother had taught me. The whole ecosystem of my actual work, the work that had once made me feel like a whole person with a spine and a set of hands that mattered. Dr. Sominyoung, my only real friend in that entire glittering, suffocating city, came to visit me there one evening, her glasses catching the lamplight, and she took one look at the shadows under my eyes and the way my clothes had started hanging looser on my frame, and said, gently, the way she said everything, "You look pale, Leila. You need a full checkup. Come see me." I brushed it off. I promised her I would come, the way you promise things you mean to keep and somehow never quite get around to. Not out of dishonesty but out of the sheer exhaustion of simply getting through each day intact. That night, after she left, I locked up the atelier and stepped out into the wet street. And across from the entrance, a black sedan sat idling, its engine a low steady hum beneath the patter of rain and the electric buzz of a nearby neon sign flickering pink and blue against the slick asphalt. It had been parked there, I would realize only later, thinking back, for 3 days running. At the time I told myself it was nothing, a driver waiting for someone, a businessman running late. I had no idea, standing there in the rain with my keys still warm in my hand, that the engine turning over once as I passed, like a word spoken low under someone's breath, was the sound of a threat I would not understand the shape of for months yet, or that the man who owned that car lived inside my own house, ate breakfast most mornings at a table not far from mine, and called my husband cousin. The road incident happened 3 months before the divorce, on the approach to Hannam Bridge, in rain that fell the way rain falls in that city in early autumn, hard and sudden and gone again just as fast. I was in the errand car, a silent guard up front as always, and out of nowhere, out of the grey sheeting rain, the black sedan came up alongside us and forced us toward the barrier. I remember the squeal of tires trying to hold a wet road and failing, the smell of burnt rubber sharp and chemical in my throat, the jolt that emptied all the air out of my lungs at once. I was shaken. I was not hurt, not in any way a doctor could find on a scan, though I would later understand that some hurts don't show up on scans at all. Taywan arrived before the police did. I remember that specifically, because it struck me even in the chaos of the moment, how fast he must have been driving, how many rules of that careful, controlled world he must have broken to get there before the sirens. His bespoke suit was soaked through, clinging to his shoulders, and the neon from a nearby sign slid across the wet fabric in long colored streaks, and the composure that 3 entire cities were afraid of was nowhere on his face. Nowhere. I had never seen him like that, not once, not in the study with the kneeling man and the blood on his cuff, not anywhere. "Who was in the car with her?" he said, and it was not really a question, it came out flat and hard, like something being struck against stone. "No one, Sajangnim," the guard said, his eyes down. "Just my men." That sentence landed on him like a physical blow. I watched it land. I rode it off alone, guarded but alone, and something in his jaw moved once, a small muscle jumping and going still, and he said only, "I want it opened," before turning away from me to speak in low, rapid Korean to the men who had gathered around us in the rain. That was the first time I saw the flaw in his fortress laid bare. All those guards, all those silent men posted at every corridor and doorway of that enormous house, and not one of them had been standing close enough to actually put a body between me and a car built to crush mine. They guarded the perimeter. They had never once been positioned to guard the person. That night I went back to sleep on the cot in my atelier, too rattled to face the enormity of that empty house. And at 2 in the morning I woke to a shadow crossing the window, the unmistakable shape of someone standing very still in the rain outside, watching my workbench through the glass. By the time I sat up fully, by the time my heart had climbed into my throat and I forced myself to actually look, there was nothing there but the street lamp and the wet, empty asphalt, shining under the light like something holding its breath. 2 nights after that, the second team came. I heard the service door groan on its hinges before I heard the glass break in the front room, and I remember lying frozen on the cot for one long terrible second, my body understanding the danger of full breath before my mind caught up to it. Taywan arrived first, alone. I don't know how he knew. I have never fully understood how he always seemed to know the exact moment something in my small orbit was about to go wrong, but he was there, in the dark, moving between me and a blade meant for my body, and I heard the sound of it entering him before I understood what I was hearing, a wet, terrible sound, and then blood blooming dark and fast across the white silk of his shirt. The fight after that was brutal and short and ugly in the particular way real violence is ugly, nothing like the choreography you see in films, just fast, desperate motion and grunted breath, and then, abruptly, silence, and 2 men on the floor who were not moving the way living men move. I sat him on my workbench under the single hanging lamp, my hands steadier than I had any right to expect them to be, and I opened my restorer's kit and threaded a curved needle with waxed thread, the same needle I had used 100 times to close a split seam in 200-year-old leather, and I began to stitch the wound in his shoulder closed, while he watched me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something raw and unguarded and almost frightened, though not of the pain. "You've done this before," he said, very quietly, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. "I've repaired things older and more precious than you," I told him, and I meant it as something close to a joke, but it came out sounding like the truest thing I'd said to him in months. He watched my hands the entire time. Not my face, my hands. And I understood, somewhere in that long silent stretch of stitching, that this was the first genuinely honest tenderness that had passed between us since our wedding day. A wound and a needle, and two people finally looking at the same thing at the same time. I could feel the heat coming off his skin even through the thin cotton of my sleeve where my arm brushed his shoulder with every pass of the needle. His breathing was slow, deliberately slow, the breathing of a man forcing his body into stillness through sheer will while pain moved through it in waves. I found myself talking, quietly, without really deciding to, the way I sometimes talked to a piece of furniture while I worked on it. A habit my grandmother always laughed at me for. I told him about the first table I ever restored on my own, a water-damaged writing desk that had belonged to someone's great-grandmother. How I'd been so afraid of ruining it permanently that I hadn't slept for 2 nights before I made the first cut into the old veneer. I don't know why I told him that, sitting in a dim atelier at midnight with his blood still tacky on my fingers. Maybe because it was easier than the silence. Maybe because some part of me wanted him to understand that I knew how to be careful with broken things. That I had built an entire life around being careful with broken things, long before I ever met him. He didn't answer, not with words, but somewhere in the middle of that quiet monologue I felt his eyes shift from my hands to my face for the first time since I'd started. And he held them there, steady, unreadable in the old familiar way, except that underneath the unreadable surface there was something moving now that I hadn't seen in him before. I did not have a name for it yet. I would spend the next several months slowly learning what to call it. I tied off the last stitch. Behind me Dihun, the head of his security, crouched over the fallen intruder and pulled a phone from the man's jacket pocket. He scrolled through it in silence, his jaw tightening, and then he held it up for Taywan to see. One recent call, saved under a single initial, M. Taywan looked at that single letter on the screen for a very long moment, and he said nothing at all, and something about the particular quality of that silence told me it was not the silence of a man who didn't understand what he was looking at. It was the silence of a man who understood it completely and did not yet know what to do with the understanding. After that night, something in the house shifted, quietly, the way weather shifts before you can name what's different about the air. There were no more guards stationed outside the atelier. Instead, some evenings, I would look up from sanding a table leg and find him simply sitting on a crate near the door, saying nothing, doing nothing, just present in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. A small packet of hair-thin restoration pins appeared on my workbench one morning. Exactly the kind I'd complained, once in passing, about not being able to find locally. He cancelled a board meeting, an actual board meeting, to drive me himself to the checkup doctor. Seo had been asking me to schedule for weeks, and I felt the whole organization's whispers follow that car the entire way there, though neither of us spoke a word about it. At the clinic, Dr. Seo's face went carefully, professionally neutral in a way I had learned, over years of friendship, to recognize as the face she wore right before she had to tell you something that mattered. "Leila," she said, studying the screen in front of her, "we need to talk about the result." The smallest secret of my entire life was 3 weeks old on the day she told me. That evening I set 2 places at the table again, the way I had on my birthday, and I lit a single candle, and I sat there with a truth in my chest so large I could barely hold it steady, waiting for him, watching the flame hold and flicker and hold. At 9 o'clock, his call came through. "A board emergency," he said, his voice clipped and distant. "Don't wait up." The exact sentence that had killed the last candle. I sat alone in the dark long after the flame guttered out on its own. And somewhere in that darkness my phone buzzed once against the table. A text from the night watchman. "The sedan is back. It's parked across from the atelier." I looked at that message for a long time, the unspoken news I hadn't told him, and the returning threat I hadn't told anyone, sitting together on the same small glowing screen, and I understood, in that moment, more clearly than I had understood anything in 6 months, that I could not keep living inside a silence this large. I want to tell you now what was written in that envelope he found on the pillow, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on, and I think you deserve to hear it exactly as I wrote it. The way he read it alone in a gutted bedroom at 2 in the morning with his composure finally, completely gone. I told him I had been pregnant for almost 4 months. I told him I found out the same week my birthday message to him went unanswered, the week I wanted to tell him over dinner, the dinner he never came home for. I told him I lost the baby in the 9th week, alone. That doctor, CO, was the one who drove me to the hospital in the middle of the night because there was no one else to call. That I had actually tried calling his office, and a man I had never met answered and told me the president was not to be disturbed and hung up before I could say another word. I told him that when the nurse asked, gently, who she should call for me, I had no name to give her, not one. At the foot of the bed, when he found the letter, there was a small pale box waiting beside it. Inside were hand-knitted cream baby shoes, so small they could sit entirely in the palm of one hand. An ultrasound photograph slipped loose from between the folded pages of the letter and landed face down on the floor. And later, much later, he would tell me the date printed along its edge was the date of my birthday. The same night the candle drowned itself in its own wax while he walked past the dining room without slowing. I was not in the house when he read it. I have only what he has told me since, and what I have imagined, turning it over so many times in my mind since that night, that it has become almost as vivid to me as memory. I imagine his hand closing around the edge of that letter until the paper bit into his palm. I imagine the composure that 3 entire cities feared simply not being anywhere in that room at all. I imagine him folding the letter carefully, almost reverently, and slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, directly over the place in his chest where it would hurt the most, and then walking, at 2 a.m, down to the security floor of that enormous silent house. "The car from 3 months ago," he said. "I want it opened, tonight." The following night, Dihun laid a single sheet of paper flat on the desk in front of him, a license plate, a leasing firm, a holding company behind that, and another behind that, 4 layers deep. "The signatures at the top are hidden," Dihun told him, "but the accountant isn't. This firm only files for one client. We've used them ourselves, for internal matters." The client's name was Park Min-jae, his cousin, his advisor, the man who had told him, more than once, over the low table where family was supposed to be safe, that marriage had made the black lion soft. Taywan set that single sheet flat on the desk, squared perfectly to its edge. A small, ordinary, almost domestic motion that somehow contained the entire fury he was refusing to let show anywhere else in his body. "Find the driver quietly," he said. "If Min-jae learns we're looking, he cleans it before we can." That same night, he came to the atelier and stood just inside the door, rain still beaded on the shoulders of his coat, and told me, in a voice stripped down to almost nothing, "I know who chased your car. It was Min. It came from inside my own house." I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, and when I did, I made myself say it slowly, made myself let every word land the way it needed to. "You kept me guarded," I told him. "You didn't keep me. Do you know what it feels like, having a guard who never speaks follow you everywhere you go? It's a cell with a view. You built me a beautiful prison and you called it love." He didn't answer that. I watched him take it in, watched his breath go in and hold, and then he said, quietly, "Then find out who really did this, not for me, for the person who answered that phone in my name and decided you weren't worth disturbing me for." He left not long after that. I heard the small bell above the door ring once as it closed behind him, and outside, though I didn't know it yet, the man he was hunting had already begun to move. I only learned what happened next from Daehun, weeks later, in the flat, careful way he told difficult things. 2 glasses of whiskey, poured in Min-jae's private office at midnight. One slid across a wide lamplit desk toward Taywan, who did not touch it. "You've been asking about a leasing firm," Min-jae said, his voice warm, almost paternal. "Ask me instead. It's cleaner between family." "Then tell me," Taywan said, "why your accountant leased the car that ran my wife into a barrier." There was one full breath of composure held between them, and then, almost with relief, Min-jae set his own glass down. "Because you were becoming a coward," he said. "The Black Lion married a furniture restorer and started sleeping through meetings. Our enemies could smell it on you. I gave you back your teeth. A few frightened nights, she leaves on her own, you harden, and the organization survives. She was never in real danger. I calibrated it. I have imagined the stillness that must have filled that room in the silence after those words." "You calibrated a pregnancy into a miscarriage," Taywan said, and Min-jae's face, for the first time, showed something other than composure. He hadn't known. He genuinely hadn't known. "No," Taywan told him. "You never know the cost of the thing you engineer. That's the difference between us." He stood. "You're out. Every account, every seat, every key. Choi is already at your door." From the doorway, as he left, Min-jae offered one last, bitter gift. "Without me, you'll go soft, and they'll eat you alive. A cornered man with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than a loyal one ever was." At 11:40 that same night, my phone lit up in the dark of the atelier. My own voice on the recording, low and steady. The voice I had trained myself into over 6 months of learning to survive that world without ever raising it. There inside, 4 of them. I counted from the mezzanine. Below me, I could already hear the service door beginning to give way with a long, grinding groan of steel. I killed the lamp with the flat of my palm and pressed my back against the old stone pillar near the stairs, breathing slow and shallow through my mouth, letting my eyes adjust to the dark the way I'd trained them to during 100 late nights working alone in dim light. 20 years spent learning how buildings are put together, learning where the old bones of a structure hide their secret spaces, told me exactly where a body could disappear in that building and exactly where it couldn't. My mind moved through that building the way it moved through a piece of furniture I'd studied for weeks, cataloging every joint and seam before I ever touched a tool to it. I knew where the original 1930s framing had been patched over during a renovation decades ago, knew where a false wall had been built to hide a stairwell that no longer appeared on any modern blueprint. Knew it because I had spent a year with my hands in the actual bones of that structure, uncovering exactly the kind of secrets that men who only ever look at buildings from the outside never think to search for. Down below me I could hear boots on stone, low voices in clipped Korean I only partly understood, the particular metallic clatter of men checking rooms they assumed would be empty of resistance. Come up the east stair, I whispered into the phone, low and urgent. It's behind the old panel. They won't know it's there. Taywan and Dehun came up through that hidden panel, and because I had told them precisely where the ambush was waiting, it closed on nothing but empty air. What followed was fast and ugly and brief, the ordinary brutal shape of real danger, and when the lights finally came back up, Min-jae's men were down, or already fleeing into the night, and I stepped out from behind the restoration scaffolding, with dust caught in my hair and my chin held high, the small gold teardrop glinting once in the returning light. "You could have run," he said, staring at me like he was seeing something for the first time. "I've had enough of running from your world," I told him. I decided to know it instead. Dehun's phone rang before either of us could say anything else, and he put it on speaker without being asked. Min-jae's voice, calling an emergency session of the council out at the family estate, telling them all that the Black Lion was dead. Taywan looked at me. I picked my coat up off the floor where it had fallen. "Then let's not be dead," I said. The council hall at the Parkong estate is a room I will never fully forget. All marble and long dark wood, the assembled heads of that world seated around a table built to intimidate rather than to gather. Min-jae stood at its head when we arrived, already deep into his indictment, telling them the Black Lion had gone soft, had married an outsider, had let the estate's files go missing on his watch, and I could feel the room tilting toward him, the way a room tilts toward the loudest confident voice in it. The doors opened. I walked in beside Taywan, not behind him, and I did not raise my voice to accuse anyone of anything. I laid down, instead, what a year of restoration work in that ancestral wing had quietly given me. A walled-up vault I had found while repairing water damage in the old family quarters. A second set of ledgers, warped and stained, that I had restored page by careful page with my own 2 hands over months I had told no one about. Because at the time I had simply been doing my job. Min-jae's true debts, his skimmed percentage, the 4 layers of shell companies, laid out plainly, in his own accountant's handwriting, for the entire council to see. I read it aloud to them, calmly, the restorer whose hands everyone in that world had always underestimated, because they had never once imagined those hands could take apart a coup as carefully as they could take apart an antique hinge. I remember the particular quality of the silence that fell over that table as I spoke, a silence entirely different from the ones I had grown so used to in that world. This was not the silence of men refusing to see me. This was the silence of men being forced, for the first time, to actually look. I kept my voice level and unhurried, the same voice I used when explaining to a client exactly why a certain repair would take the time it took and no less, because rushing it would only cost them the piece entirely. I did not raise it once. I did not need to. Somewhere around the 3rd shell company, I watched 2 of the older men at the far end of the table exchange a glance I understood immediately, the particular look of men recalculating, in real time, exactly who held the power in the room they thought they already understood completely. My hands did not shake as I turned the water-stained pages of that second ledger, the same steady hands that had once threaded a needle through his shoulder in a dim atelier, the same hands that had spent a year quietly, patiently peeling back decades of hidden damage in that ancestral wing, without ever once imagining the damage I was really uncovering. I thought, standing there, of my grandmother's voice in my ear from years ago, telling me that every restoration eventually reveals what the original builder tried hardest to hide. I had believed she meant it about furniture. I understood, in that council hall, that she had been teaching me something far larger than that all along. Minjae's planted men, moving through the estate's corridors to seize control while the council was distracted, found nothing but dead ends and locked passages, because I had mapped every one of those corridors myself over a year of quiet, patient work, and I had shared that map with no one but the man standing beside me. The coup died in the very room it had been born in. Minjae was taken alive, at Taiwan's direct order. "You said you'd rather lose everything," Taiwan told him, his voice flat and final. "You were right, you lose it, but you live to watch it stand without you." Then, in front of every witness in that hall, he stepped forward to the head of the table, slid the black lion ring from his own finger, and set it down on the wood in front of me. He bowed his head. "I was the collateral," he said. "You were the empire all along." I looked at that ring for a long moment. I did not take it. "I don't take anything tied to the old contract," I told him. "Put it away, Sajingnim. If there's ever a next ring, I'll choose it myself." The whole council seemed to hold its breath at once. I turned toward the door, and his voice stopped me before I reached it. "Then what would you take?" I did not answer him that night. Some doors, I have learned, are better left open a little longer than feels comfortable, so the answer that finally walks through them means something. Weeks later, in a smaller house outside the city, I sat across a private table from him, with a folder, a lawyer's letterhead, and a pen, and I picked the pen up myself. "I still want the divorce," I told him. His face did not change, and somehow that stillness itself was its own quiet kind of hope. "The marriage we had," I said, "that one is over." I set 2 rings down on the wood between us, side by side. "If we try again, we start from zero. No secrets, no disappearing. And the first time a guard stands where you should be standing, I'm gone, and there won't be a letter waiting for you this time." He covered both rings with his hand, and for the first time in the entire year I had known him, he let me see the whole of his face, unguarded, uncalculated, simply his. Weeks after that, in the gray light of an early morning, I stood at the kitchen counter with 2 mugs steaming in front of me. And he came in barefoot, the black lion still rising above his collar even in an undershirt at home, and I turned before he could say a word and slid a small box across the counter toward him. New baby shoes. Not the pair from before. That pair lives folded in a drawer we visit together, quietly, on the hardest days, and I think it always will. "This time," I told him, "I wanted to tell you first." His mouth opened. No sound came out of it at all. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long steps and held me and did not let go for a long time. I felt his heart beat against my shoulder, quick and unsteady in a way I had never once felt it in all the months I'd known him. Not even in the atelier with a knife wound bleeding through his shirt. Not even in the council hall with a ring set down on the table between us. There was a version of this man that only ever surfaced in the smallest, quietest rooms, and I understood, standing there in the gray morning light with the steam from 2 mugs curling up between us, that I was the only person in his entire world who would ever be allowed to see it. Not the council, not Dihun, loyal as he was, not even the ghost of the cousin who had once tried to burn this whole life to the ground in the name of protecting it. Only me, in a kitchen too small to hold 40 rooms of anything, holding a man who had spent his whole life mistaking silence for strength. "Then tell me everything," he finally said, his voice rough against my hair, slowly. The gold teardrop caught the morning light at my throat, and outside the window the city was waking up slowly around us, the way it always does, indifferent and enormous and beautiful. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, neither one of us was standing alone in any of it. I thought, in that quiet kitchen, of the woman I had been a year earlier, signing my name once on a page in a cold office and walking away with nothing but a coat and a necklace and the particular pride of a woman who refused to be bought. I did not regret that woman, I never will. She was the one who made this morning possible, the one who understood, long before he did, that the only way to survive a beautiful prison is to first refuse to want anything it offers you. It was only after I stopped wanting his rooms, his name, his money, that he finally became a man capable of offering me something worth keeping. I have thought about that more than almost anything else since. Sometimes the bravest thing you can say to the person who has all the power in a room is simply, "I want nothing that belongs to you." Sometimes that is the only sentence strong enough to make them finally see you. I rested my hand over his where it lay against the small box between us, and the teardrop caught the light one more time as I said the last thing I needed him to hear. This time, the silence already knows the answer.